During the French and Indian War, what we begin to see in warfighting capacities or capabilities by Europeans is this very deliberate move towards using asymmetrical tactics that really Europeans and the Americans wouldn't see until World War II and really specifically till Vietnam. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society podcast. Irregular warfare, by definition, is not routine, common, and can therefore be regarded as asymmetrical or unconventional. Yet even a surface level study of warfare or the history of warfare tells us that this premise is just false. Irregular warfare is far more common according to the historical record, particularly the further you go back than its counterpart, conventional warfare. And conventional warfare is a relatively modern or new discipline springing up in Europe roughly in the 16th century, evolving to its relative peak during World War II, where state actors deployed various military disciplines in concert with one another. Just think of like the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and so on. While irregular warfare has existed for time immemorial. According to Winston Churchill, the 7 Years' War, more commonly referred to in the United States as the French and Indian War, specifically in North America, should actually be considered the First World War. The reason Churchill makes this claim is because the 7 Years' War was fought on a multiplicity, or rather in a multiplicity of theaters, much like both world wars in the 20th century. During the 7 Years' War, the British were allied with the Prussians, while the Austrians and the Spaniards took up arms with the French in opposition. And these were just the major players. So both sides would go on to recruit local fighters or indigenous fighters, dependent upon which theater war they were fighting in. Battles against these nation states and their allies took place all across the globe in different areas such as the Americas, Europe, Africa, and India, as well as throughout Asia. And they were also fought in nearly every sea, which included the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and even the Indian Ocean. Most individuals from the United States are really only aware of the French and Indian War, but are oblivious to the larger drama that played out globally. Although the sort of concept of the United States didn't obviously exist during the middle of the 18th century, it's still a really important conflict. It's, the French and Indian War is still considered by many historians and scholars as being a part of American history, despite the fact that it's often overshadowed by the Revolution, obviously. And the events within the French and Indian War would rapidly lead to the Revolution. Now, this fact is also true regarding the history of special operations units. Nearly every American SOF unit that I know of that exists today claims to be or conceptually, their unit came from Robert Rogers and his company of Rangers. However, this claim is wrong-headed, specifically because there is no direct lineage between Roberts and modern-day Rangers or Special Forces units or even Delta Force. The only link that exists between modern SOF units and Rogers and his Rangers is the use of the use of standard practices and their tactics and various strategies that many would, I believe, inaccurately refer to as irregular warfare or unconventional warfare. Moreover, complicating this matter even further, Rogers was loyal to the British and, in fact, fought against the colonialists during the Revolution, and therefore is not really or should not be considered a true patriot in the modern sense. Although even this is a little murky because what we read or what we discover when we read the history is that he attempted to ally himself with the colonials, but Washington, as well as other officers within the colonial ranks, wouldn't accept him. They didn't trust him. And so he was kind of forced in some way, shape, or form to go work and operate with the Brits. One thing is for sure, though, Rogers was a soldier through and through, as we shall see soon and discover throughout the next however many episodes we do here. To fully understand and appreciate asymmetrical warfare in this period and beyond, particularly in American history, one must first truly understand what symmetrical warfare or conventional warfare is and ironically, how uncommon it is in the historical record. Max Boot, agree with him or not on his politics today, he did write a really good book about all of this called Invisible Armies. And he says this, quote, "Guerrilla warfare, it turns out, is as old as war itself. Though the term guerrilla is relatively new, the form of warfare it describes, irregular, unconventional, and often asymmetrical, has been with us since the beginning of recorded history." End quote. The concept of conventional warfare, rather, is rooted in Western civilization and how Western powers have historically conducted warfare. Victor Davis Hanson outlines kind of loosely this concept within his book, The Western Way of War, and he suggests, generally speaking, that Greek hoplite armies would march onto a battlefield during the campaigning season. They would meet each other head on and then just wreak havoc on one another until ideally there would be a clear victor and a clear loser. And afterwards, the armies would just return home. Obviously too simplistic, but in an ideal world, this is indeed how Greek police would prefer to fight so they could establish a decisive ending to the conflict or violence. Now, eventually the Romans adopted and improved upon Greek tactics, weapons, and military organizations until they were eventually standard practices throughout the Roman Empire. Now we had the enlisted and officer corps. Romans had uniforms. They even had rules and regulations. But chiefly, Rome was able to raise a professional army where they had, infantrymen, engineers, cavalry, even a navy, all these different administrative bodies, and even auxiliary forces to supplement their professional force. Now, juxtaposed to Rome's enemies throughout this time, think of Germania, Britain, North Africa, and even in Greece, they had just a radically different military machine at their peak than their near peer enemies. Western armies, and particularly Rome, dominated battlefields for centuries and were able to expand their territorial reach further than any other empire previously. Eventually, with the fall of Rome, the strategy, the organization, and really specifically the professional soldier faded. And for centuries afterwards, most armies were made up of landed aristocracies within a feudal system. And yes, occasionally to beef up their forces, knights would raise levies, which were effectively untrained militia who would join them either as sort of a support element, if you will, or they acted as auxiliary or infantrymen. However, the Western way of war endured for centuries despite these setbacks. And during the early and middle medieval period, members of the knightly class created rituals around warfare and took steps to reduce the likelihood of death explicitly among their European enemies and sort of equals, if you will. And instead what they would do is they would capture and hold their opponents hostage rather than killing them on the battlefield as they had done in previous eras. Obviously, peasants, on the other hand, were not as lucky. Knights routinely targeted peasants as a way of injuring their enemies without confrontation. Peasants also were soft targets, and knights could easily access resources and booty from these lower classes by raiding villages and towns and so on and so forth. But as populations grew throughout the Enlightenment era, rulers and state leaders began to develop the articles of war and military superstructures not so dissimilar from their ancient Roman counterparts began to materialize. The sort of crystallization of articles of war took place in the later half of the second millennia throughout much of Europe. And with the rise of nation states and firearms, armies looked more and more like the armies that had once existed in the ancient Roman period in terms of just their organizational structure and professional armies, or professionalism, if you will. In the Western world, because of the Judeo-Christian cultural foundations, these individuals, these civilizations began to respect innocent or civilian life, especially the lives of other Europeans who were largely uninvolved in warfare and who were often just caught in the fray. To reduce civilian casualties and other types of destruction, Western armies began to adopt various rules and regulations of how war was to be fought. The purpose of war was no longer to just obliterate your enemies and their civilian populations, but rather to achieve a political victory through violence, sort of as like a last resort. Once one side was defeated, the violence was over, and the state was mobilized to determine determined its terms. Although this may surprise many, given the fact that the 20th century was so bloody and so violent, the methods by the Europeans in the development of the Articles of War achieved its aim in so much as it reduced casualties of war and on their civilian populations. On a per capita basis, modern wars that took place in the West, including both world wars, were far less destructive than those that took place during a more primitive era, as well as in non-westernized territories. So, for example, the Javaro, Yanomamo, and the May-Enge were primitive tribes in the New World and Australia, and during times of conflict, they lost somewhere between 38 to 80% of their male fighting age male population. Comparatively, male combat-related deaths, including both US and Europe during the 20th century, only constituted 1% of their male population. In pre-Columbian Americas, where asymmetrical warfare was completely common, if not the standard, it was routine for natives to obliterate their enemies, what we would today call genocide. Unless, of course, it made more sense to enslave and keep the defeated enemies alive so long as they provided some advantage to the victors. Genocide, rape, torture, theft, and mutilation were all commonplace in these conflicts. This type of warfare occurred nearly on every hemisphere, including modern-day North America, Mesoamerica, South America, Africa, Australia, and Southeast Asia. For example, it was not uncommon for braves in North America to castrate and scalp male combatants or civilians and then burn their dwellings. Not only was this typical, unfortunately, but it was expected, according to Lawrence H. Keeley, who wrote extensively on the subject matter in his book, War Before Civilization. To modernize Europeans fighting in frontal assaults and shooting one another in tight formations, it seems totally bizarre. And furthermore, it just goes against common sense. However, when one considers Hanson's thesis in the ways Western armies fought historically, or generally fought, I guess, it sort of becomes more clear and begins to make sense. Western armies meeting in a distant battlefield, lining up in tight formations, attacking each other head on until one army is decisively destroyed or routed, signals a clear victory and, once again, the end of violence. This way of war was inculcated in the West in large part due to European religious social values and practices. Furthermore, going against these articles of war was not only taboo but criminal. Although not universal, European armies extended their articles of war to other groups or military members, as well as their own, who weren't necessarily organically part of their forces or ranks. As we shall see in later episodes, during the French and Indian War, English officers routinely directed Robert and his Rangers, which included Native Americans, by the way, to provide quarter to those who surrendered, including both the French and their native Indian partners. Moreover, Rogers was known to have promoted some of his Indian allies to the rank of officer within his ranging companies. Symmetrical war in the West is traditionally organized, disciplined, law-abiding, and transparent, or at least that's the intention behind its design. And of course, there are countless examples of when Western armies stepped out of bounds and broke their martial laws. They committed massacres, atrocities, and even genocide. What is noteworthy, though, is the fact that when Western armies are or were in breach of their laws of war, there are and were serious consequences. While the opposite was or is not the case. There are other cases of other non-Western nations, empires, or kingdoms that fought in the sort of, again, symmetrical fashion or conventional fashion, similar to Europeans, but it was not by any means the norm or the standard. Most literature in the modern period about non-state actors, particularly Native Americans, depict them in this sort of Rousseauian noble savage archetype, and they either ignore or describe their atrocities in a nonchalant manner. Yet, when European or American armies commit similar massacres, there is a distinct shift in language suggesting their actions were indeed abhorrent. So, for example, when European immigrants or colonists attacked native populations, particularly their dwellings or their homes, there's universal condemnation even back then as well as today. Yet when native tribes or groups committed similar or worse atrocities against their native neighbors or Europeans, mum's the word. This Western way of war is typically referred to as conventional warfare, despite its infrequency, and moreover, that it developed over a period of a couple millennia within a specific region and culture. Warfare that existed throughout this period outside of the West, and more specifically for the rise of Western culture, is more often referred to as unconventional warfare or even total war. However, historically, humans who fought wars outside of the Western paradigm used all means necessary to destroy their enemy, up to and including their absolute destruction or enslavement of both combatants and non-combatants. The tactics deployed in these conflicts rarely involved meeting an opponent on an open battlefield. Warriors ambushed, raided, and assassinated their enemies. And this meant striking their opponent when they least expected it. And they wanted to essentially inflict as much damage as possible and then evacuate the area before the enemy could organize themselves to strike back or even defend themselves. Now, one of the oldest treatises, if not the oldest, on warfare of this kind is The Art of War by Sun Tzu, and it is all about utilizing these tactics. His underlying message is to never meet your opponent head on and always play to your strengths against your enemy's weaknesses. He argues to attack your enemy when they least expect it and then retreat when the odds are completely stacked against you. The underlying message is to be unpredictable in your way of war, i.e. to harass, terrify, and overwhelm your enemy into submission. And if you can't achieve this without engaging the enemy head on, well, even better. All these tactics and techniques are indeed considered in the West to be a major part of unconventional warfare or asymmetrical warfare. Furthermore, armies or raiding parties during prehistoric times and outside of the Western paradigm were made up of amateur fighters, or another way of describing it is non-professional soldiers. When a conflict would end, these temporary combatants would just return to their former jobs, as farmers or artisans or merchants or whatever. Moreover, because there was no standing army and there are no logistical administrative bodies to supply and feed this sort of primitive fighting force, the job often fell to, unfortunately, the civilian population, which included women and children and the aging population. And in fact, during offensive strikes, the women and children would assist their male fighting force as an auxiliary force. Native American women, for example, would pull wounded combatants off the field, or they would strip felled enemy combatants for booty or even execute wounded enemies that still clung to life. Therefore, it was routine for bands of warriors to target these groups in order to undermine and cripple their enemies' abilities to fight wars or wage a campaign. I mean, without logistical support, armies, prehistoric or modern, are just unable to conduct offensive or defensive campaigns. Villages are attractive hard targets because they are often weak and typically there is little to no resistance, particularly during a surprise raid. The upside, tragically, of targeting innocent civilians is there's easy access to booty, slaves, and resources without much risk to the raiders. In the context of history, the terms conventional and unconventional should be reversed. And this is what we're really trying to get at. Given the fact that most armies rarely faced one another in pitched battle, and more often than not, used asymmetrical tactics to gain an advantage. Therefore, in this podcast, unconventional warfare, basically we're going to refer to it as asymmetrical warfare, and conventional warfare, we're going to use the term symmetrical warfare instead, or in place of that. Now, as Europeans progressed into the modern era and began to expand their borders, they quickly came into contact with non-Western civilizations who exclusively or nearly exclusively conducted asymmetrical warfare. Now, historical accounts of Europeans engaging with these indigenous groups are saturated with frustration, disgust, and horror. For example, native warriors took trophies from their defeated enemies, such as ears, scalps, tongues, fingers. And in the medieval period in Europe, by the way, knights, it was totally commonplace for them to take heads as trophies so they could prove their victory against a specific enemy. But by the 16th and 17th century, this was no longer the norm, and these practices had largely been outlawed. As Europeans became entangled with natives, they were very frustrated with constant shifting of allegiances, which was totally common in the French and Indian War, as well as the inability of Europeans to fully control an undisciplined group of allied Native Americans. It was commonplace for European commanders, by the way, to give native auxiliaries or scouts or soldiers an order which they'd disregard and would often do as they pleased. In this primitive way of war, combatants did not feel compelled to follow or maintain any sort of military discipline, but rather took what they wanted and what they thought was rightfully theirs. An example of this was in the mid-18th century when the French and their native allies surrounded Rogers and his Rangers on a slope of a hill during a skirmish, and the Rangers were totally fucked. A group of French allied Indians were about to completely outflank and outmaneuver Rogers and his Rangers and summarily destroy them. But during their advance, they discovered that the Rangers had abandoned their packs, and within the packs were flasks of rum. So what did the Native Americans do? Well, they quickly decided to abort their assault up the hill and instead got inebriated. During this era, the West quickly realized their formal civilized way of war, symmetrical war, was ineffective against those who were conducting asymmetrical warfare. In fact, utilizing symmetrical warfare against a guerrilla or an insurgent force was not only ineffective, but it was completely counterproductive. This problem would continue to plague the West not only in the 18th century, but well into the modern era and up until today. And to effectively combat an insurgent force like Native American Indians operating with the French or the English, Robert and his Rangers needed to create their own insurgent force. Moreover, North America was a vastly different operational theater than Europe and other countries. The territory was not only wild, but completely unfamiliar. There were very few people aside from the natives who could effectively navigate the rugged terrain around them. And compounding the issue even further was the complete lack of infrastructure that would maintain any army elsewhere. So when the English or the French went on campaign in North America, they were forced to bring all of their resources with them and could not rely on civilian populations like they had done throughout Europe in the medieval period, specifically in, I would say, like the 14th, 15th, and even 16th century. The French and Indian War was predominantly about controlling various areas, specifically, or rather particularly, the Ohio River Valley, so to ensure their respective mother countries would have a monopoly over both resources and the natives who had easy access to these various raw materials. The way they controlled these territories was to build various forts throughout the hostile terrain, not so dissimilar from FOBs or forward operational bases that the United States used in Afghanistan. These forts could house soldiers, traders, support elements, and supplies. From these strongholds, the French and the English could deploy their forces to patrol and dominate the surrounding areas, ensuring their control over precious resources and the trade routes and the natives that were involved in all of this. But the terrain was inhospitable. I mean, the Appalachian Mountains dominate the interior of the East Coast and actually divided English and French territories in the 18th century. But because the terrain and the lack of forage, horses were a burden and nearly useless, especially during wartime. The landscape dictated that lightly armed soldiers needed to operate in small bands or groups and could therefore move hastily on foot or, more often than not, on various waterways. This is why building alliances with natives and understanding their way of conducting war was absolutely critical to both the British and the French. And unlike the British or the French, natives were familiar with the terrain, they were lightly armed, and could move long distances on foot while living predominantly on the land. Initially, the French were able to very effectively tap this native resource, but prior to the initiation of war, the British had forced the natives westward, and in doing so retarded their relationship and provided the French with a natural ally, who were already situated in the north and the west of the British beyond the Appalachian Mountain Range near the Great Lake region, and were ready and more than willing to receive these displaced natives. Prior to the outbreak of war, the French deployed their native allies to attack and harass British settlements, colonialists, and etc. The French were terrified that the rapidly growing British population that was settling in the region would eventually move westward during this expansion. They were seeking to prevent that. The rising tension between the two countries is what would eventually lead to the outbreak of the French and Indian War, but fundamentally, the victor would dominate the contested region of North America. Now, eventually, once the war had officially begun, the English realized They needed a way to effectively gain intelligence and execute their own version of asymmetrical warfare against the French. Because the natives were often unpredictable, as previously discussed, the responsibility of this sort of asymmetrical tactic or warfare fell upon the soldiers of bushfighters who had grown up in this harsh environment and were familiar with asymmetrical tactics used by the natives. One of these figures who led this effort was Robert Rogers, and he was probably the figure in this era, and his company of Rangers, who were also notably made up of companies of additional auxiliary Native Americans. The Rangers became vital to the war effort. Like the Native allies and foes, the Rangers could move across vast terrain in a matter of days, regardless of the time of year, up to and including the dead of winter. They would readily capture enemy combatants, gather intelligence, as well as conduct long-range reconnaissance on French forts throughout all of this sort of wild terrain, giving British officers the upper hand. And moreover, they were often utilized to support larger campaigns when the British needed their main fighting force, or were rather leveraging their main fighting force. The British would even use the Rangers for lightning strike direct action missions deep behind enemy lines. What is astonishing is after the French and Indian Wars, though, when the colonists revolted against the British in the US Revolution, they reverted back to fighting in a symmetrical war. And really, it wasn't until World War II, Korea, and Vietnam when we see the resurgence of asymmetrical tactics by nation states. In this next episode, we will discuss Rogers' upbringing and how he was shaped and molded into the bushfighter that the English crown would use to combat the French and their native allies. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. We'll see you next time. Deuces.